The book of Exodus is the second book of Moses, and it was written right around the same time frame as the first book of Moses, the book of Genesis. Moses would have physically written this book down sometime between the years 1450 to 1410 BC. But we must understand that the events that are being recorded are picking up the narration about 400 years after the events of Genesis. You may recall, and I encourage you to watch our overview video for Genesis if you're not familiar with that book, but Joseph had been brought into the land of Egypt ahead of his family, and God had arranged for famine to be on the earth, and so all of Jacob's family, all the sons of Israel came into the land of Egypt and were able to then multiply in the land of Goshen, where they had been doing so for about 400 years. And as the book of Exodus opens up, a new Pharaoh has arisen who has forgotten about Joseph and the favor that was shown to him. And now the relationship between the Egyptians and the Israelites is not favorable, but there is one of harsh oppression by the Egyptians towards the sons of Israel. The book of Exodus itself is one of the most iconic books in Scripture. And what I mean by that is even people who aren't familiar with Scripture have been influenced by the events that are told in this book. There have been many Hollywood movies that have been made about these events, and anybody who's ever gone to VBS or attended church as a child has heard some of these stories in some fashion before. However, these things don't always give us the most accurate picture of what the Scriptures truly teach, and so my recommendation to you would always be that you would sit down and read these Scriptures for yourself. The book of Exodus is 40 chapters long, and if you were to sit down and just read that from beginning to end, it would take you probably a couple of hours, but it's worth doing so. There are many passages in this book that, like I said, are iconic and have touched people in many ways, and I'm included in that group. But the intention of this isn't to go through every single passage that has been meaningful in some way. That would take us forever. Instead, in this brief video, we just want to briefly overview this entire book. Now, there are many ways that you could outline the book of Exodus, and I'm sure scholars debate that and could argue over which is the best. But I think that it's most helpful for us to think about this book in terms of the three major geographical regions that are represented. The first 14 chapters revolve around the land of Egypt. Then we're going to see in chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18, the Israelites are going to kind of move around throughout the wilderness. And then from chapter 19 to the end, in chapter 40, it's going to revolve around Mount Sinai. In the first 14 chapters, we are introduced to the changing situation. We are once again brought to the land of Egypt. We're told that a new Pharaoh has arisen that has forgotten Joseph, and that they begin to severely oppress the people of Israel. We then see how God is working in the life of Moses, even from his birth, to make him an instrument in his hands. Moses eventually has to flee from Egypt, and he goes into the land of Midian for a while, where he then encounters God, who meets with him from the midst of a burning bush that is on fire, but the bush is not consumed. That is one of those very iconic passages, and it's very influential for the rest of Scripture because God then reveals to Moses his name. Moses is sent back by God to go back to the people of Israel to tell them that God intends to deliver them. Although the nation of Israel is initially excited to hear these things, Pharaoh is not willing to let all of his slave labor go. And so God begins to do a series of plagues, 10 plagues total, that are ultimately going to culminate in the Passover. As this is happening, we see that things get even worse in Egypt. And there's a time when the people even begin crying out against Moses. And Moses himself says, God, why did I even come here in the first place? Everything's getting worse. But God always intended, as he told them from beginning to end, that he was doing these things so that the whole world would know that there is a God in Israel. God is intending to make a people for himself, to bring them out of the land of Egypt, and to do so that the whole world will know that there is a God. After the Passover, the Egyptians begin to chase the Israelites, and we get another one of those very iconic scenes when God miraculously brings his people through the Red Sea and then drowns the Egyptian army in the waters. That concludes the first major section revolving around the land of Egypt. Then in chapter 15 up through 18, we see the people kind of wandering around in the wilderness, and there's much that happens in that particular time period as well. But then it gets to the next and final main section, which is at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, again, we get some of these very iconic scenes where Moses goes up on the mountain and he receives the law, he receives the 10 Commandments, he receives instruction from God. But there's a break in this main section that we could really break up into other sections as well if we wanted to break it down a little bit more. Moses comes down in Exodus 32. There is a very important scene when the people of Israel, led by Aaron, have gone into apostasy. In fact, they've made a golden calf and they've begun to worship it, calling it by the name of the Lord. This infuriates Moses, and it also infuriates the Lord. Moses smashes the tablets that he received from God, and in fact, many people die that day in judgment. But the Levites, Moses' own tribe, they distinguish themselves that day as being for the Lord, and they come out from the rest of the people. And then Moses intercedes with God, because God is threatening to send them up to the promised land, to send them up to the land that he promised to give them, which he brought them out of Egypt for, but without going on his own. In this part of this narrative, we see Moses do something that is so important. He refuses and he pleads with God, saying, God, if you're not going to go up with us, don't send us up from here. This sets up something that is so important in the book of Exodus and really is so important for all of Scripture, to understand that the true desire of God's people shouldn't be just to have blessing, shouldn't just be to dwell in the land of promise, shouldn't just be to have the land flowing with milk and honey, but the true treasure of being the people of God is that he would be our God and that we would be his people. Moses says, I don't care how great that land might be. God, if you're not going with us, don't send us up from here. Then God responds to Moses, and the covenant is renewed. He goes back up. He spends another 40 days and another 40 nights on the mount. That's recorded starting in Exodus 34. And then God gives more instruction and more detail, particularly about the tabernacle. I know that many modern English readers can kind of get bogged down, especially once they hit chapters 35 to 40, because after receiving all of this instruction, especially about the tabernacle, then we all of a sudden get all this detail now about the tabernacle being constructed exactly as God told them. Something that might get missed, especially if you find that repetition boring, is that there's a repeated phrase over and over as you read through this narrative saying that Moses and the people did exactly as the Lord commanded. In fact, people are so excited based on this law to give freely. They give their gold, they give their materials, and the Spirit of God comes upon two workers in particular to make sure that they have the skill to do everything correctly. And Moses oversees the entire project of the tabernacle, and they just repeatedly state over and over and over again that they didn't deviate from what God said. They do exactly as the Lord commanded them, which leads to the ultimate culmination of this book in the final part of Exodus chapter 40, when the glory of God comes and dwells in the tabernacle. The entire book of Exodus, bringing them out of the land of Egypt with the miraculous powers and signs, bringing them through the wilderness into Mount Sinai to reveal his law and reveal the plans for the tabernacle, culminates in this glorious, beautiful part that God actually comes and dwells in their midst. And there are four main theological themes that we should point out just as we're thinking about this book. The first is salvation and deliverance. We see that God is able to deliver his people with a mighty right hand. God promised to bring them out and did just that. We also see that God's purpose and plan in doing these things isn't simply to do this for the comfort of his people, but it's so that the glory of his name will be proclaimed to the ends of the earth. This is an old covenant idea and a new covenant idea. When Jesus teaches his people how to pray, he teaches us to pray in this very way, that we would pray to our Father who is in heaven, and we would pray that his name would be hallowed in all the earth. Jesus instructed the same thing that God was declaring from the beginning, that our desire should be in line with God's desire to make his name famous in all the earth. A third theme that we see is election. God is sovereignly choosing. And this doesn't just begin in the book of Exodus, but it actually, God's sovereignty and election is just a continuation from what we saw from the book of Genesis. God chose Joseph and sent him ahead, and God sovereignly ordained all of the details of earth to bring into the land of Egypt so that 400 years later, he could bring them out with a mighty right hand. God lifted up Moses and made him an instrument in his hand. He did the same with Aaron. He did the same with Bezalel and Aholiab, and to give them the skill in order to make the items of the tabernacle. In fact, he even did it in a non-believer in Pharaoh, and he was doing it for the entire nation, whether they grumbled against him or not. And so the theme of election and how God works to choose people for the glory of his name is massive in the book of Exodus. But the fourth theme, the main theme, I would say, of this book is the presence of God amongst his people. It's so important for God to be able to dwell in the midst of his people. And that's what this book culminates in with the tabernacle. We need to understand this theme, especially as we go into the next book, the book of Leviticus, because many modern readers don't really understand the purpose of that book and may even fall into the error of thinking that it's irrelevant for us because we live in the new covenant and not in the old covenant. If we understand the importance of the presence of God, Leviticus takes on a whole new depth, a whole new meaning, something that is certainly in line with the blood and the sacrifices, but something that really points us to the glory of what Christ was doing so that God's presence could remain amongst his people, both then and now. If you like this video, don't forget to click that thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel so that you won't miss any of our future videos.